since you're all joining, if you wouldn't mind saying in the chat where you're coming from. To introduce myself, my name is Dan Garfield. I'm the Chief Open Source Officer and co-founder of CodeFresh. And today we are very lucky to have the guest, Cody De Arkland, coming to us from LaunchDarkly. Cody, welcome.
How's it going?
Very, very good. And Cody, you've been, how long have you been at LaunchDarkly?
We are actually just cruising up on 2 years. We are about a month, maybe a month and a half shy of 2 years.
Oh, nice. Congratulations on the upcoming anniversary. And for those folks that don't know LaunchDarkly, you guys do feature flags. And so we're going to be talking about feature flags today and getting into that as a feature. And I know this is something that I've seen a lot of, where there is often confusion about when to use feature flags and what they're used for, especially because we've done a lot of stuff with canary releases. If you're using CodeFresh, or if you're using Argo rollouts, you're doing canary releases, and people will oftentimes look at that and they'll say, "Oh, this is how I test new features. This is how I do user acceptance testing on my new features. Is I do canary releases." And we always say, no. You really should be using feature flags. So we're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about CI/CD and how it relates. Just a housekeeping reminder that this is an interactive experience, so please feel free to submit any questions that you have. We'll do our best to tackle those live, and we'll probably sneak in a couple of polls in there as well. And then I think, Cody, before you went to LaunchDarkly, you were at Kong, HashiCorp, VMware. So you're not new to the software delivery world. You've been doing this for a long time.
A little bit.
And you were actually on the Jeopardy episode. I don't know, for all the people that didn't catch that, we did an event called, what was it called now? I don't remember what it was called. But it was called Build and Deploy 23. And if you didn't get that, we'll post a link in the chat. But we had an amazing set of demos, and we talked to all these end users about different things that they're doing. And we showed some of the ways that some of the patterns that are really helping people deploy software more effectively. And we played Celebrity Technology Jeopardy. And Cody, I seem to remember that you did quite well. So we don't want to spoil it in case people didn't get a chance to see it yet. We'll throw it in the chat. It's there. Add it to your watch list. If you didn't catch it, definitely at least you should be watching the Jeopardy session. So
there's a great plot twist in there. I'm just gonna say, like, I'm not
there
gonna
is a huge plot twist.
There's a great plot twist in that.
Yeah, you have to wait till the end. And it looks like Brandon's coming back online. Brandon, are you back with us?
I believe so. Boy, what good timing for that. A nice little crash from OBS right at the beginning. Always a good start.
So I just got through the introduction. So Brandon, I think it's a good time for you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. So hi, I'm Brandon Phillips, Principal Technologist at CodeFresh. We've been doing this merging to main for, I think, 4 sessions now. We do one a month, and we talk about CI/CD topics, and we just get on and we hash some things out. We learn some things. We argue about some things. We talk about best practices. We talk about the scary war stories that people have dealt with. So that's what we're going to cover today.
Perfect. And Brandon, I think I'll go off camera and I'll be hanging out in the chat, and I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, Dan, for covering for me in that unexpected scenario. It's always fun. Cody, thank you so much for joining today. I think this is going to be a fun convo.
I'm excited for it. It's definitely going to be a fun one.
All right. So I guess, just a brief intro here. Let's just start, Cody, for those that are not familiar with feature flags, why don't you just give us some of the most common use cases that you see people use them for?
I think the first times people experience like a traditional feature flag, there's a lot of different ways that you can use them, but let's think like just ground floor concepts. People want to be able to dynamically turn a thing on or off, right? So most commonly, I find people kind of stumble into like a UI element, right? As something, or maybe they're building a new login component and they want to change it in some way, or they're rebranding their site, they want a new thing. And these are like front end feature flags, very visual, and people want to be able to very quickly turn those on or off without having to do a complete redeployment from the ground up every single time.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I would agree, like, I feel like usually you hear it talked about mostly on that, the front end side, the visual aspects that customers see or people see. but there's actually a lot of feature flag use under the hoods that, that isn't talked about that often. So
Yeah, I mean, people will, we talk to like a lot of customers who use them to like roll out new API connectivity, right? Like there's a cool use case out there. I was vendor world, can't always say customer names, but there's a really cool one where they use it to dynamically change the connection pattern for someone based on where they're at. So like when people are at their local office in, use Sacramento as an example. If they're in Sacramento, they might connect to a database on the West Coast, and like that this customer does that through feature flags. And like these are persistent flags that last longer, right? The one we talked about before is something that usually is like on for a little bit, they eventually
Right.
phase out and they get the new theme deployed. This would be one that's more long term, but like that's a really like creative and interesting way to use it. That's funny enough. That's the story that kind of like sold me on coming to LaunchDark. I was like, wow, that's a really cool example of how people take this idea and make it like more useful than just rolling out a change.
Right, and hoping to operationalize it, right, in a
Yeah.
useful capacity, I guess. Sharon, yeah, why don't you go ahead and kick off that poll? Let's just find out, how many people are actually familiar with feature flags and if they're using them. I think it'd be great to see. And then let's go into a really broad topic here, and there's a lot to cover here. But let's just start with, what role do you feel like it plays in the software delivery process? Obviously your CI/CD, the delivery aspect as well once you're productionalized, but like where do you see it fitting in?
I think there's two versions of this answer, right? I think the best place for where a feature flag lands is right after that deployment step. It's we talk about the idea of software release as its own independent step. And so like
Sure.
as you do the CI stuff, you're running tests, you're taking your build components and you're building your software, and then CD being the deploy, it goes and ships out somewhere. There's this next step of how you make that available to users and how you roll out that change to actual users. So like most commonly we see it land there, and like that's where in the CI/CD kind of process it's right after CD. But I think people use it often inside of CI/CD. There's some dragons there you want to be careful around, right? If you're every single time you run a pipeline you're toggling feature flags, like you might want to think about what targeting rules look like, who's going to receive that change, things like
Sure.
that. But generally we think about it in the idea of breaking apart like the release process from CD and giving you better control over that. And that applies really to any feature flag platform for what it's worth.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And so, you mentioned there be dragons there. I mean, in my experience, one of those dragons is actually kind of the cultural side of this. What are your thoughts on that? Because I feel like there's definitely some resistance to feature flags to begin with, and then there's like a windfall of adoption, and then there's kind of the post-mortem of, oh god, we made a bit of a mess. Like what's kind of your take on this?
Yeah, it's funny. I think that we're as technologists, we oftentimes fall into like the trendy tech thing, and like Kubernetes is a great example of that, right? Like there was a minute there where Kubernetes was everywhere on every platform was on a
Yeah.
Kubernetes migration. And then things settle and we start to look at like the operational things that make the most sense and how to actually do stuff the right way. But like I've seen it happen with feature flags a ton of times where people like the flexibility, right? You get a lot out of it, and all of a sudden you have this ability to dynamically turn things on and off and push values down and change the way your app works based on who's getting it or based on who you've targeted. And so then you over rotate on that. And then all of a
Yeah.
sudden it's everywhere. And then everything inside of your application is a feature. And then what gets really scary is when people start nesting that. And then it's like, I have
Yeah.
this parent feature that has 4 features inside of it, and 2 of those features have features inside of them. And it's like, okay, now you've created this like operationally brittle thing out of the flexibility you have. Suddenly you've created flexibility at every part of this chain, and now the whole thing just bends. And that's not great either, right? So there's a balance there of making sure that you're making the right choices when it comes to how you build out feature flagging.
Yeah, I guess that's one big tip already is like maybe don't make the Russian nesting doll of feature flags, right? You don't want it to be 10 layers deep.
Yeah, we like you to have a functionality per feature flag. That's like a good place. And there's always edge cases, right? Like there's always someone who'll say, well, I have this one that makes sense, and totally, but just be sparing how you approach those and think through like the downstream impacts of that. Because really like the power of feature flagging is being able to break your code into manageable chunks that
Yeah.
you have great like flexibility and granularity around. When you overdo that, then again, flexibility just turns into a very bendy line, which is not always great.
Right, right. You want to achieve that iterative deployment capability, but without like making it messier than it was before, for sure. Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, cool. Looks like we got the poll results back. So the audience, a lot of feature flag users out there. It looks like we have some folks that aren't aware of feature flags. So it's cool that you're here. So thank you for joining us. You should learn a lot today. We have a lot that are already users, and then about a little less than half of the audience are not using feature flags today. So, this is a potential chance for you to figure out where you can utilize it, how you might implement it, and see whether or not it's a good fit. So, yeah, good participation there from the audience. So that was really, the broad topic of where it fits in. But let's dive a little bit into the implementation side now, because I feel like, when I've worked with teams that are implementing feature flags, or even on development teams in the past that I've worked with, there's always a challenge on where do you start with feature flagging? How do you start with the implementation on that? Do you have any recommendations from that side?
I could just coming from more of like an operational background, I always like to look for the lowest hanging fruit. Like oftentimes that ends up in practical use, that ends up being like kind of the next thing you're developing or the next component that's getting work done on it. But I also think about like where's a place that I need the most flexibility, something I want the ability to adjust out and change a behavior around. Um, the easiest place is always an area that has a clear separation from other parts of your code. Like I use the login component as a very ground floor example. All right, if you're rolling out a new login component, it's very easy in theory to just frame that out and say, hey, I'm gonna have this feature flaggy if then statement around this, and if it's on, the new one's present. If it's off, the old one's present. And I think that model translates to a lot of things. So think about areas where you want the most flexibility in your code, and somebody in the audience might be saying, well, what does he mean by flexibility? You want to be able to target specific users with it. You want your help desk to be able to turn something off if there's a problem. You just want additional controls around that specific part of your application. Might be a storefront that you want to be able to change the inventory of at a specific time. The holiday season, you want higher value ones to be on top. So you turn on a feature flag to say, hey, enable the featured store items, just as an example. Think about where you want flexibility, and that feature flags can give you that flexibility there. So low-hanging fruit, areas that make good impact, areas that you want to have control over, be able to disable if there's a problem, recover for users, things like that is usually a good place.
Yeah, it was really, and one part of your comment kind of caught me, which was the in theory part. And I appreciate that because we're working in hypotheticals here, but I think we all know in implementation, there can be some wrinkles. But one of my takeaways as well from that perspective is, when we had teams, we had various teams that kind of own different areas of applications and services. And I really think you want a subject matter expert to actually be the person deciding, who's going to or where and who's going to put in feature flags. Just because I feel like if you don't have a SME actually deciding that, you can end up with some really scary situations potentially. So that's one of my takeaways anyway.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting thing to think about there around when feature flags stop being just a developer problem, right?
Yeah.
Like, because I think that when it's isolated the development team, then absolutely, like somebody on the subject matter expert for that component should be really deciding where these things go.
Sure.
But I think like when you start doing this at scale and you start looking at how to operationalize this or how to use it like the best ways possible, I would never want a developer to be the one choosing targeting rules for a feature flag, as an example. Like developers oftentimes aren't that close to the customer to really say like, I want XYZ business to be able to test out this new feature for us right away. Usually it's like a product manager.
Right.
I also wouldn't want the product manager deciding where in the code to place feature flags, right? There's there's an interesting line there. And so like being able to give that person, like a product management team, the ability to manage targeting rules for features is like an interesting area where this stops being just a developer problem. Or the SRE team being able to disable a migration that was done with a feature flag because at 2 a.m. they suddenly got a ton of reports of like, actually, hey, this failed, this is not working. And that's where you start getting like operational scale and how teams start using like the whole feature management idea versus feature flagging.
Yeah, and I think
a whole different conversation.
it is a whole different conversation, but it's very relevant because it teeters back into the people, the cultural the cultural process, and actually building kind of the collaboration around it. Whether that's through tools or process or however you want to do that, it's like that part becomes essential to managing this once you scale up, right?
I think it's like the whole, the little, like DevOps preachy. That's like the whole DevOps concept, right? Of like
Yeah.
how you make other teams able to participate in like that DevOps cycle, and like how you have them be able to adopt these DevOps practices. I think that's what makes like a good DevOps tool, is something that can scale beyond just one group inside of an organization.
Right. And have each team take like appropriate levels of ownership and, have some investment in it as well.
Collaboration, all that good stuff. Absolutely.
Exactly. So that's where teams would start. But I guess the question is, when you're creating features and let's say you have a product manager that says we're going to build these features and it's going to take 3 sprints, and you have developers actively working on it and they're delivering code, at what point do you think it's okay to merge in code that's going to be behind a feature flag as a developer?
Yes, and this is purely our take, so I'll just I'll frame this there. Like, this is just a Darkly perspective. I think that backing off, like, why are we scared of merging changes? Because we don't want to break our core code base. We don't want the trunk to be broken. We don't want
Sure.
the main our main to be shattered in some way, and we can't compile now. We can't run. We can't build all of these things. But I think that if you're using feature flags right, you're able to isolate out the problem areas and turn them off. If you're not merging frequently, those problems oftentimes can become a lot more complex to solve. If I've got a 5-person developer team, we're each building multiple different feature flags for maybe same features, overlapping features, different components. That process of bringing those all back together into the central branch or central main can oftentimes become very complex. So my take, I like to merge often to main. I like to be having everything like that whole trunk-based development concept. Everything lives in that main base. We're committing frequently in there, but we're intelligently placing protections around that to prevent the scary things from happening, the problems from happening. And I don't mind broken code living. It's not, obviously, as long as I can compile and my pipeline can finish and I can deploy out. I don't mind broken code in there as long as I have that flag in place that's protecting my user impacts. At the end of the day, that's what actually matters. What actually matters isn't like what matters more is if users are able to experience your product in the right way. And if I can control that, I have a lot more freedom around shipping that code out. So merge often, get into main often, move forward with life.
Yeah, I also appreciate that tactic, and we're a company that moves pretty quickly too. Although it does make me wonder, you specifically you mentioned trunk-based development. What happens if you're not in trunk-based development? Does feature flagging still have a place?
It does. There's just you're increasing your operational complexity, right? Like if you're, and what I mean by that in this case is the five developer team example. Say we're redoing our website entirely, and I'm taking on the login component. You're taking on the storefront component, and Dan's out there working on the website theme. There's natural overlaps that exist inside of that.
Sure.
And if I'm building independently and we're all doing our best work, we're heads down 6 hours building out this page, and we've created these overlaps and we all go to merge in now or changes, we're going to deal with that merge conflict experience and whose conflict wins and which one is right. How far down the road are we? Which changes are going to have to ultimately get squashed out or get discarded out so that we can fix these overlaps or fix these merge conflicts. If we're doing these in smaller batches, smaller changes, and committing them often, the chance of our drift getting so far apart from each other that we're ultimately going to lose productivity is a lot less. And so I think there's still a place for it. In some ways, it's even more important if you're or if you're working in individual branches. But you just run the risk of like a really challenging reconciliation time when it comes time to actually bring these together and do like a proper merge to main. Shout out to the title of the show.
Yeah, no, that's a good take. And it is kind of interesting because I do think there are a lot of enterprises that are, I'm not going to, well, maybe I will. It's more of a legacy mindset where they're on, different branching strategies, or they have long living branches, or even some people that are forced to because they maintain multiple versions for clients, and in instances like that, like I still think there are use cases to feature flags, but it does become very complicated to manage and understand those if you have feature flags for, long living branch A that customer ABC uses and feature flags that are different for these customers. It gets pretty complicated.
Well, and I think of it like the scary one to me is we have a main where we've committed often into it. And now
Yeah.
this feature flag, Cody's flag controls this certain aspect of it. But in branch one, that development is further behind maybe, or maybe it's further forward. And that scope of that feature flag is different in that environment. How do we
Yeah.
as operators, like if we're not keeping that stuff in one central branch and we're not managing this very intentionally, how do we start to keep track of like what is actually impacted by this feature flag without having to dig into the code every single time?
Right.
That's where things get like really scary to me, is like when the functionality behind a flag is different between these different branches, which makes your user experience change between the two. And I'm very sensitive to like good user experience in that way. So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And good user experience, I think, is the important thing to take away here, right? Because at the end of the day, you're delivering software, whether it's internal or external customers, and like the focus of whether it's feature flags or feature delivery from the software side is to deliver something better than what they
yep.
have, or stable and better, you know. So we had an interesting question come in, and I think we can kind of expand on this. And they're interested in some advanced use cases or best practices involved on managing feature flags. Like if you have a large multi-tenant SaaS, you know, do you have like a few things that jump to mind right off the top of your head that you'd recommend?
Yeah. So early on, you want to decide. First off, you want to decide what your breakpoints are, in the sense of, and these are organizational discussions. Like a lot of this is a culture conversation to have within your engineering practice. But do you want your breakpoints to be between the microservices? So using the example I said before of like the store versus the login. Login's a bad example in that case. But let's say you have an API system that handles your login and then you have your front end. Do you organizationally want to manage those different? Does your engineering team span across both of those? Because a lot of this is going to be dictated by your work practices. And
Yeah.
so in an organization where you've got generalists across, everyone works on every part of the application and they just effectively pull the next issue off, it probably makes sense to have kind of one overarching project that spans both of those. But if you have an organization where you do fence things off, you have back end engineers and front engineers, and you have someone who specializes in store operations or whatever, breaking those apart a little bit, fine grain has a place too. More commonly, I think that people, and this is a Cody hot take, so we'll open those up early. I think people complicate it early, and they look at how to intentionally break these things apart into different areas, and they focus really highly on like separating these things out. And then operationally, as they become more proficient, as they start to figure out like the functionality and how to manage actual risk more, the idea of like how to separate these things becomes less of a focus, and really the flag becomes like the central point of value and central point of control. And it's like, hey, we have 6 microservices, but really they're all part of Cody's store application, and that's the overall project. And these feature flags all live within there, and I'm using, tagging, or I'm annotating these in a good way to illustrate the differences between them. I think operationally that gets a little bit easier, as opposed to constantly switching between. Again, not to say there's not a place for the other one. I just think early on, people worry about this a little bit more. What I would focus more on and I'm reading the question in here too, like in multi-tenant environments, I would focus more in a multi-tenant environment. Every tenant should have its own section, right? Like
Right.
that,
Should be siloed off, right?
yeah, it should be siloed off for sure. But I would focus more on team delineation and roles within your platform, whatever feature flagging tool you use. Focus on role definition. Like, what does a PM do? What does an engineer do? What is a senior engineer able to do versus a junior engineer? Focus a little bit more on those components and how you break that apart, because that'll handle like how you operate the platform, how your operational cadence looks, as opposed to trying to fit into the model of like, I want all store things to be in the store project, because ultimately you're going to have things that'll bleed over into both. You're going to want to be able to
Right.
coordinate releases between, like, your store might not function unless your API is enabled, right? You might have an API route that's behind a feature flag. You're going to have a hard time creating conditions and dependencies between those two if they live in completely separate environments. So
Yeah, and obviously a multi-tenant SaaS where you're maintaining for many, many prospects, that's a very complicated situation that can lead to complexity in more areas than just feature flags too, right? So I'm sure you're already dealing with a lot of that. Um, One thing that I do want to go back to, though, you're kind of dancing around talking about, teams sometimes almost forcing the complexity like too early, unnecessarily. And it's something that I've experienced too, as part of an engineering org and with customers as well, as just because you start to utilize a process or tool, it doesn't mean you need to go in and use every feature on day one, right? Like it's cool, but it shouldn't be the goal.
I remember my first pipelines that I built, like when I was learning how to like properly pipeline, and I would treat it as like every task was its own like stage of the pipeline.
Yeah.
And it's like every single like line of a custom bash script was its own task that I would then like spend more time trying to figure out how to wire between steps.
Yep.
When in reality, it's like, okay, these 4 things are like enough that like we can just run them together. It's a very simple example, but I think that like you figure out these concepts and you embrace them and you want to do them right. So you
Yeah.
over embrace them. And then you take a step back after 6 months and you look at like, wow, I've created an operationally complex thing. Where can I smooth out these edges? And like these 4 steps never break. So why don't we just put them together in their own little stage
Right.
and do that? Same thing with the feature flags, right? Like these 4 are often used, never like they're often used. They're low complexity, but high value. Like these can stay forever. It's not a big deal because we use them that way. I think it's just, and I don't think there's anything wrong necessarily with those things. I think it's stuff you learn operationally as you go, and you're going to find out the bad stuff really fast anyways. Like those things are going to bite you really quick.
Oh, and they always do. But it is interesting because I do think there is a big benefit from letting some of the growth and use of tools be a little bit more organic than forced.
Totally.
Right. Utilize it when you need it, utilize it when it makes sense. And also, typically you're developing like internal champions and kind of utilize it when those internal champions can communicate it out and make sure the other teams are aware. I think that's also an important factor here. So we just got a question in. Just kind of reviewing it now. Okay, so they're asking, they have basically business features that are being rolled out and they're separated out by like warehouse, finance, billing, and they're large features or changes that they want to make available to customers, but they're not, comprehending where the use of feature flags and trunk-based development, means every big or small feature will need a feature flag. And now you have tons of feature flags being controlled by development teams. Like any thoughts to kind of deal with that, the spaghetti of feature flags?
Yeah, I think there's a feature flag lifecycle question in here around like, or there's a answer that's around feature flag lifecycle and how you manage that internally. It's a bummer because like, as I'm sure you get the same thing, like Brandon, like as a technologist, I love when the answer is like a technical solution. It's like my all of my joy when I can show you how to like throw 4 lines of code in that solves a problem, and like we all feel good about that. But the hardest ones are actually like people challenges, and it's actually like process challenge. And when it comes like this example, flag lifecycle, there are features that make that better. Like we have something called code references, just as an example, that lets you see where in your actual code feature flags live. So when you're cleaning up, it's easy to find where those live, but it's still on you as a person to go in and do the cleanup and remove that functionality or remove the flags out that aren't being used. I don't think that having a lot of feature flags is a bad thing. There is such a thing as too many, right? We can overuse them in complicated ways. I don't think that there's a limit of you should really have less than 10 in your application. I mean, I know of a couple customers who have over 1,000. I look at things like frequency of change, likelihood of change as kind of 2 big drivers of life cycle.
Sure.
And things that have a zero frequency of change, like as in they're enabled when they're good, we're done changing and we never change it again. You've got to get those scheduled as part of your dev cleanup. We hear like fun examples where companies get pizzas once a month and go through and clean out. It's like a code cleanup day, and they clean out comments that are not useful, or they restructure comments. They do feature flag updates as part of that, kind of that code hygiene thing. But again, that's a culture thing of driving a better culture around it. But I think a lot of it comes down to how you clean them up, and not just how, but if you clean them up, because not all feature flags need to be cleaned out.
Yeah.
Some are permanent, right?
Well, that's interesting because this kind of leads into the next area that I wanted to talk to you. So thank you for that question, which is, and you already we've talked a lot about the cultural side, the people side. But I've seen and I have concerns, that feature flags, they can become a crutch for teams, that aren't really perfecting the other parts of their development process and release planning. And it can lead to feature flags potentially becoming a bit of an anti-pattern. So you talked about the cultural side for this. Is there anything else that you can bake into, let's say, the software delivery process or the code review process that can help to keep this from happening, from getting these out of control?
I think good early on, like good annotations around what's a temporary flag versus a permanent one. Usually, pretty early in development if something's going to be a long-term flag or not, right? Is this feature going to be one I'm going to change in the near term only, or am I going to like a login screen, right? You're only going to redevelop that once until the next time you refresh the application.
Right.
That one should be cleaned out. And like there's technology things like where you can annotate those flags and say like temporary or some sort of P4, anything P4 or older is or P4 or higher is a or a temporary flag, right? Like there's annotations you can do around that. That's the thing that comes most to mind around this, as well as like I mentioned before, like the idea of being able to track where flags are being used in code and understand that. But that very quickly gets into a people process thing and less of a tech solution.
Yeah, but the code references though is really helpful, right? Because it is going to identify, like, flags, their uses, and how frequently they've been enabled, and potentially then you can kind of build your own process around like how old these flags are, right?
Exactly. And I'm trying not to make this obviously like an advertisement for LaunchDarkly because we do feature flag stuff. But there's definitely tooling that makes that side of it easier, like tracking and like flag insight usage, evaluations, frequency of evaluations, and all of these things can become really like helpful. A good example is we have a mobile customer and they do flagging, targeting of flagging. So for those who don't know, big part of feature flagging when you graduate beyond just turn on or off is targeting, right? Controlling, I want these 4 people to get this flag or the West Coast people to get this flag value. They do targeting based on device type and software version of that device type. So as an example, like iPhone version, software version 15 gets this. And what they do is they use flag insights to track when they see like the drop off and then there's no more people evaluating that specific software version. And then they retire that version of the flag out because there's no one people evaluating it anymore, like, or it's below 10% of their customers are evaluating that flag anymore.
Sure.
And they just, that amount, they want to end their backward support for the old versions. So they don't have to worry about continuing to develop for legacy systems. Tools like that go a long way to help you like keep this stuff moving forward in a healthy way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I'll just throw in some of my experience from the past as well. We did have a situation where feature flags, quote unquote, kind of got out of control once people were kind of having fun with them. And we wrote a custom plugin for linting software that actually looks for feature flags and kind of flags them as part of the merge process so that they get an actual review and a pull request. Because we were looking for a way to basically make sure we had eyes on these, right? Which can help sometimes. Okay, so we got another question in. Yeah, so he's asking, a lot of them are related to front end features, but is their flag logic still implemented at the back end and also at the front end? Yeah. And what prevents users from hacking their way around the flag? Well, I mean, they'd have to have access to either the configuration on the back end, Pierre, or they'd have to have access to your source code. So I don't think there's a risk there. Go ahead, Cody.
Yeah, it's totally one of those like, I remember when I was in like the customer side of the world, we talked about like once they have access to your server, it's over anyways. Like, you have way bigger problems at that point.
For sure.
Than people circumventing your feature flag because they have access to your whole code. Like speaking for our platform, this is part of like the runtime. So me hitting a browser, I can't impact server side code. All I can do is read it.
Right.
Me hitting a front end, I can't impact that. All I can do is read it, like, and see the values that I'm getting. I can't actually change those. So circumvention is usually one that we kind of disqualify early on because it's just not technology wise, the way these run, it's not possible unless you have access, to your point.
Yeah. I mean, I don't, from a feature flagging perspective, I don't worry about that aspect. I will say that I do worry a little bit about unfinished code getting into production. But that's what you're trusting like your other linting tools and stuff to evaluate to make sure that you don't have vulnerabilities that are going out there and stuff like that. But in regards to backend versus front end, I've seen feature flags used in both places, and almost always in both places. Some people utilize it for things like environment configuration as well to dynamically switch things. So there's all sorts of different ways that you can use it. But yeah, it's not limited only to front end, although that is kind of the popular case that's listed out there. It goes further than that.
Yeah, I think LaunchDarkly, as an example, we did our internal database migration using feature flags, right? Obviously, being a feature flag
You
company.
kind of have to, right?
Yeah, but like a couple of like interesting ways it was used that I didn't consider until I read the whole kind of like the tech write-up on it is a flag that enables consistent writing in both locations, so you can ensure you're getting consistency between both databases, right? So V1 database you're writing to, you enable this flag, suddenly it's writing to V1 and V2,
Mhm.
and it's doing a check to make sure that the same in-state values are coming out there. And then being able to layer on targeting on that and say, okay, only Cody is the only one writing to both. We can do fine-grained inspection now and say, okay, only one person is writing to both. This is consistent. Let's expand it to 10. Let's expand it to 20. And then a separate flag that controls the entire turn on or off of connectivity between the two. So like,
Right.
okay, we've had 2 weeks of consistent writing and reading from both locations. Everything's looking good. Now we're going to turn on the actual cutover and we're going to use number 2 as the primary, while number 1 is running as just a backup for a time. Like that's a really interesting and common pattern.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it can ease some of the pain of doing a transition like that. I mean, I know we use feature flags internally for very similar things, like customers that have been opened up to new integrations, but on the back end, it might actually be pointing to different configuration that goes to, a different instance in AWS or a different instance in Google Cloud to, utilize this database. So I think there's some really cool dynamic things you can do there. But again, it all comes back to like, I think some responsibility here, right? Making sure that you're using them in a responsible manner, and it's not config management, it's feature flagging, which is a different idea, right? It's really around the feature that you're exposing, not, I guess, the supporting infrastructure in most cases.
Totally.
Yep. So you've mentioned long-running feature flags a couple of times. So I want to tap into this because for a little while it was like there was a lot of talk around permanent flags. And is that a good practice?
I mean, there's there's a funny answer to this. So I'm a fan of permanent flags for what it's worth.
Okay.
Like not overusing them, but like I think that there's real operational benefits to using them in like good places. We did a few years back, we did the first run of like the state of feature management report, just partnering with a bunch of DevOps companies, and like ultimately found like people were not really using permanent flags. This past year when we did it, we saw like a significant increase in the amount of people using flags as like permanents and like truly changing configuration. Now there's like a Q&A in here that we can tap into in a few moments around like configure environment configuration versus like feature configuration, and like should you be using feature flagging for pushing environment config? There's a whole thing we can unpack on that. But I do think that there's a place for when you want the control over functionality that's displayed to a user or consumption model stuff, that a permanent flag is fine. I just don't think you want every flag to be permanent, and you really need to make sure you're cleaning up the ones that aren't, so that you're just not creating a hard to read or confusing code base to implement or to manage down the road. That's how you have like an aged feature that you promoted into production, but you never clean the flag out, and then eventually someone turns it off on accident for some reason, and you have 6 versions old feature roll back into prod for live, and everyone's like, what is this mess?
That's so permanent feature flags scare me. I'll just throw it out there. I think from a developer perspective, I think they're a little terrifying. The things that concern me are, one, like I really feel like if a feature is fully baked and it's part of GA, I want that code to go away. And the second part for me is the documentation aspect. Because I think what happens over time is you make so many massive changes, and maybe someone documented it at one point in time, but now there's a whole bunch of other code that wraps around the feature flag that has unintended consequences, and the documentation is now wholly out of date and doesn't cover, so that, like, I have some concerns there, but I get that the use cases are there, and I've seen a lot of people utilize permanent feature flags. I'm just always kind of going back to, like, are you getting benefits out of a permanent feature flag versus just merging the code and having other application driven logic that determines this? And
Yeah, I
again,
think
it's a balance, right?
the ones that jump out to me are the database example is a good one. Um, if you had a primary and a secondary and you wanted to maintain flexibility between them, there's actually not a lot of like great solutions for doing that, like outside of like DNS or like infrastructure, solving this in infrastructure, right? Like we can solve this in infrastructure in a lot of interesting ways, like load balancers and TCP and all that stuff. Like we can get around it that way. But if you want to keep costs low and you want to keep it centralized inside of your application, like being able to wrap two database locations in a feature flag and control that long term and say, hey, once a month when we take secondary off for maintenance, we flip over to the secondary one using a feature flag and turn it back. I think that's a healthy long-term operational flag. Can't think of many other ways I would do that scalably that I could like hand off to an operations team to control inside of my code base and without using infrastructure to solve it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the question that we got too that was asking about Spring configs and config maps is particularly interesting because, Spring config and feature flags share one really nice benefit, which is they can dynamically update the runtime.
Yep.
So it seems like they could be kind of interchangeable in that aspect. But I also think a lot of it, from my perspective, comes back to ownership of, the values that you're talking about changing that impact the application. Who actually owns that? Is that the developer team? Is it the platform team? SRE, security? Because I think that can play into, where you're going to decide to put this and how it would impact the app.
Well, there's another thing to the question and chat around the config maps and Spring config is what's your fallback value, right? Like how does the app perform in the
Yeah.
rare event that you lose connectivity? Somebody tweaks a network setting in your AWS VPC and all of a sudden you've lost connectivity to your database or to your feature flag platform. How does your app respond to that? And have you coded in good safe defaults, right? Because that's where things like where pushing configurations goes really, really wrong is when people don't have safe defaults. And so like in the database example I would always have my secondary be the safe default because
Right.
generally secondaries are up and running because something might happen to your primary. So if you have good, intelligent, safe fallbacks, then like the scariness is taken away a bit. All you're getting is operational control. And when something
Yeah.
goes wrong, it fails over. But if you don't have like a safe default, say you didn't code in a safe default at all, well, now you have complexity of like a feature flag layered on top of an outage. Like there's challenges there. So there's definitely architectural considerations. It shouldn't be like a lightweight decision to make. You should be pretty intentional on it.
Yeah, but I mean, to be fair, like in regards to that, if you had Spring config or you had console KV store and you were checking a value there and you had logic coded in the application, if you didn't have a good backup there, you would still fail anyway, whether it was a feature flag or whatever.
Exactly.
So you were talking about operational control. That kind of leads me into, who typically has the access and control over the feature flags and activating them. And I mean, is there any differentiation between, let's say, like a small shop and a large enterprise?
So I see most commonly like on teams that are early to mid journey, they're most of that stuff lives with like the development team and good change control process gets submitted and it goes hands off to a developer and developer makes the change inside the platform. But at the midpoint, like at the middle of complexity and up, we see that very quickly start to span out. The most common teams I see SRE teams
Sure.
inside, and they're usually more so focused on enable or disable, right? Like, and what happens is it gets included in like their SRE run books. And it's like, hey, in the event that, store app goes down, check these flags first, check these values first, see what's here. There's parts that can be disabled to recover here. Here's a path for that. And then I see product managers heavily involved, both from like measuring effectiveness of feature flags, like experiments and things like that, or targeting rules, being able to say, hey, I want to make sure this customer is able to experience this component. And in that model, there's usually kind of like the three teams that are hitting it most. There's developers who are building the flags, establishing the flags, handing off operational control to the SRE teams to keep stability, and then handing over day-to-day interactions to like the PM team to do targeting rules and things like that.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense.
And then like high governance environments, help desk gets involved, like more, maybe not so much help desk, but more like senior help desk doing the enable or disable a feature based on change control. So a PM might say,
Yeah.
I'm ready to enable this feature in prod. I'm going to submit for approval. It goes to the help desk. Only the help desk can turn it on and say, good to go. Right. Like that's like the true governance version.
Yeah, and we see that too on the deployment side, even outside of feature flags. It's like once you get to a certain scale, you often have a change management board. It's got to go through there, get approval. It goes up to senior help desk guy. He's the button pusher. And now it's got the seal of approval. So,
Yep.
yeah, where does the security team typically come into play, like with feature flags? Because we haven't really talked about them much.
I think it's an emerging space a bit.
Okay.
I think when you've architected in a way that you've highlighted areas that are part of like security runbook, like security remediation runbooks. I have one customer who LaunchDarkly has one customer who uses a feature flag to manage rate limiting on their system.
Okay.
So when they get too many inbound requests, a person based on certain characteristics might get dropped into a group, and that group has a flag enabled that reduces their rate, or they're rate limited now. And then a webhook fires that says, hey, we had a new user qualified as this and got dropped into the rate limiting group. Might want to look at them, and maybe they can only make 3 requests a second instead. That's kind of like you want the security team to review that and be able to remove that user remove them from that group if they are using legitimate functionality that just got misflagged, or keep them in there and banish them to that existence if they are a malicious user, right? So I think those are models. I think a lot of this comes down to, like, again, people process, how you're building run books, and what like delineation you're making on a feature being a security one. Another one's like, if you're rolling out something like a HashiCorp Vault, that's probably going to be a security team based feature flag, right? Like, how are we handling, dynamic credentials? How are we rolling out that capability?
Sure.
But I think the security use cases are a little bit emerging at this point.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And it is interesting because I have seen a very similar example to what you just mentioned, which was feature flags were kind of embedded as part of a fraud detection engine. And it was on a customer level, it was flipping on a flag to like, they've been determined to be a fraudulent user. We don't let them proceed through with the cart, or don't ship it, or whatever it is. And it's an interesting use case for sure.
Because I mean, at the end of the day, like, if there was one like big thing I think everyone should take away who's never touched a feature flag before, think about functionality in your application. Everything's a feature to somebody. Like, as a customer, I don't care if, I don't know, Blizzard.com migrates their backend database. Like, it doesn't impact me at all. But I can guarantee you someone inside of Blizzard, that's a feature to them. And that's like functionality that they're changing inside of the app. And so, like, think about the functionality of your application. Like, the fraud detection was like, that's not a feature, but it's a feature to somebody inside of that company. Like, the ability to dynamically respond to that is a feature to someone.
Well, it's a feature to the company to protect their inventory and revenue, right?
Totally.
Yeah, it's interesting because we've talked a lot about, just recently, like the users and who's going to enable the flags. But the big red flag that comes up for anyone that's like modernizing their DevOps processes, that sounds like a manual process. And you're supposed to be automating everything that you can automate. So is there a balance in feature flagging between automating, enabling feature flags, or disabling, or like the manual process side? What do you typically see?
Yeah, I absolutely think that there is. I think early days, people tend to default to like manually looking at these things and wanting the control. But as you gain confidence, automating works. Like, I think that the login page example, if I've created my targeting rules in a really good way and I have a good testing process around those, taking a feature flag enable command and putting that into the end of my deployment pipeline isn't the worst thing ever. Like, there's positive that you just have to be aware of. Like, the operational flip side of that is now every time this pipeline runs, it's going to turn that back on. So you have to really make sure your targeting rules are set up right. And so it's like, you want to be able to automate these things, but you have to be aware of what happens when you automate them. I've seen people talk about automated remediations, meaning if the UI gets 100 errors a second, we're going to automatically disable a feature flag. That's great. Just know that automation happens every time. So there's no like edge case here where sometimes it doesn't fire. If it's 100 errors a second, it's going to fire and you're going to turn it off. So just make sure you've handled like that condition of what it looks like when something turns off. But then there's also like the traditional like workflow automation stuff. Like, workflows that run to do staged releases. That's all good things. Things like ServiceNow integrations and what the sequence events and pipeline interactions. Those are
Right.
all good. Just be aware of the operational flip side of it. I think everyone should get to a place where those are automated, but the journey is really important of what that looks like getting there, and not creating more operational pain.
Right. And I think if we go back to like the large enterprise example, like even if you automate, let's say the rest of the DevOps side, you might actually have that the change management or ServiceNow, and like the example that you used, that's actually the triggering function to determine whether or not it's enabled or disabled, which is still kind of manual, right?
100%. Going back to like my customer enterprisey days, there's also the question of like, what's worth automating,
Right.
right? Like if clicking a button is half a second, like, is that the low hanging fruit? If it is, that's great. Like that there's totally a version of this where it's like, yeah, that is worth automating. But I always like to ask that question of like, what are we doing? Like there are things that are so simple to automate that probably aren't worth it. And there's things that are so complicated that automating them might not be worth it. And like, you really want to find that sweet spot in the middle and chase down automating in that range.
Yeah. Well, one thing I will say though in that regard is, okay, if it's going to be manual, it has to be manual. You know, it may not make sense to automate it. Make sure it's visible to all of the stakeholders though.
100%. Yeah, visibility is a whole different thing, right? Like you don't want it to be like a hidden thing that's manual for sure.
Right. And I'll pick on CodeFresh because we've we move quick sometimes, and there have been feature flags where I'm like, what? I didn't know that feature flag even existed, and it got delivered 2 weeks ago.
Totally.
Okay, so we got a question in regards to like the combination of a blue-green canary deployment and how you would introduce feature flags and kind of what's their impact there.
Yeah, I think so. When I think of things like blue, green, canary, there's two versions of that. There's the infrastructure side of that equation, like how you roll out a new deployment to a destination system, and then there's inside of the application. I think I like things living inside the application. I like having that control to be able to immediately roll back. I don't like a 45-minute pipeline that had 80% success rate and wondering if I'm going to fall into that 20% when things go wrong. So being able to run that inside of the application is very good. I think that there's still a place for like the infrastructure level canaries, infrastructure level deployments where I'm rolling out this change and it's pushing to a new kube cluster, and I want to make sure that that cluster is able to actually handle this. And so like there is no 100% one way or the other answer here. It is a combination of both. I like canaries. I tend to default more to canary rollout when possible. I think blue green is costly in a lot of cases. And if I can do 10% of my traffic going to the canary instance and get good data off of that, I'm more than happy to do that. But blue greens have their place of being able to like roll back an entire thing at once to the previous location. So
for sure.
It's like the kill switch versus progressive rollout thing. There's very different methodologies.
Right, for sure. And I'm kind of like, I guess I'm in the same place. I'm like, why not both, right?
It's totally a why not both. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because they both can really fit in. So unfortunately, we're getting very close to the end here. So let's try to wrap up. So if you had 3 killer features that teams would get from utilizing feature flagging, what would those be, Cody?
But so first one, always my first, targeting, right? Like the idea of a targeted release and being able to say only West Coast, only my dev team, only my QA users. That targeting is just a huge boon, and it's going to give you so much flexibility in ways that like without doing it you can't ever see, or you can't ever like think of. The kill switch, it's always a goodie. Being able to like disable something that's broken immediately without having to redeploy is really nice, and that lets teams go in and craft how they actually fix an issue.
Yeah.
Third one. I do like the code references, but I'll do that in a different reason. Like I like it more from a team perspective and like an internal team culture. When I bring someone on the team, I don't want to have to like, I want to make sure the time I'm educating them is spent on like valuable things, not here's line 47 where the flag is. I want to teach them how to fish and give them the ability to go find where code is themselves and say, oh, I'm able to find where all of Cody's flag is in our code base because of this. So one of those is a LaunchDarkly feature. The other are feature flags in general.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's great. And so we do have to wrap it up here, but it's been a great conversation. So first of all, thank you to the audience for your patience with my technical difficulties in the beginning. And thank you so much to Cody for joining us today. I really enjoyed our chat. I mean, I think we could do another session on this easily. Do you want to plug anything else that you're doing right now or share where people can find you?
Yeah, I definitely, I don't have the link handy, but we're having a software migration summit. We do these summit events every couple of months where we go through and talk about an interesting way people are using feature flags. And this one coming up is our technology migration summit. We're talking about how people adopt new APIs using feature flags and LaunchDarkly, how people migrate databases. So if you want to see how to do API migrations, database migrations, it's a solid event. It's like 2 hours. It's a short one. I'll do a live demo there. My team will be
Nice.
presenting. It'll be fun.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. I'll definitely have to check it out. And thank you to everyone else for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's session, we're doing one next month with Mark Panthofer. He's a VP of DevOps and Cloud at NVIDIA. That's going to be on July 11th. And we're going to talk about coexisting between Kubernetes and legacy technology with your CI/CD, which is always a challenging place to be. And I think many companies are there. I'll go ahead and drop the registration in the chat. And then if you're looking for some GitOps related specific content, Dan Garfield, who came on and helped out earlier, he'll be doing GitOps the Planet on Wednesday. The next episode is on building Argo with Michael Crenshaw from Intuit. So I believe we can drop the link to the Twitch chat in here. And then on that note, I think, Cody, are you able to stick around for a few minutes if people have questions?
Let's do it. Yeah, I got a few minutes.
Cool. All right. So we'll be here for just a few minutes if you guys have questions. But if not, thank you again so much for joining. I'm glad it seems like we got some good comments that people were getting stuff out of the session. That's awesome. Like we got a question in here. I see. So like when you're dealing with regulation. So basically they have two AI modules that are being delivered. One has already gone through regulatory clearance. And so it's, cleared to be delivered into production and being run. The second one is not, but they kind of have them both living in a short-lived branch. How do they use feature flags in that case? Well, I hate to say it, but it's just really, from my perspective, it really depends on that regulatory process and review that it has to go through. Because I don't know, like for example, I've worked with healthcare companies in the past that I won't name, where they still utilize feature flags, but they literally cannot deliver any code that's not going to be executed.
So when I was at the utility, the way we had built our process, because a lot of those like regulatory bodies, they care about what your documented process is, and they care about user impact and documented process. And so the way we crafted our documented process was, if we could have code in place, but it couldn't be user visible, and we had to maintain control over it. We didn't use feature flags at this point. This was a whole different thing. And so in the case of the AI model, if you've built your regulations right, you've set that up in a good way, you should be able to have that code. I would want those all in the same branch in the perfect world, and I would want the new model to be behind a flag that was only enabled for the specific testing teams. And that would be my defensible statement to like the regulatory body would be,
Sure.
This is for development. It's isolated down to this group. Here are my controls, right? Because a lot of the regulatory bodies want you to demonstrate controls. So I would write in my control doc, here's my controls. Only these members inside of my company can add people to this group that get access to this flag. That's scoped down. Only the people who have been through security training can do this. And they're usually sign off on that. So model 2 would be behind that feature flag. The default would be cleared model. The updated model would be pending approval. And then I would gradually test that out. And when I got approval, maybe that regulation was, you can run this in North America, but EMEA still wants to run validation before they'll certify this. Use targeting rules to say, hey, only within these regions can this run.
Yeah. And I think that control doc that you're talking about is critical here, because like in my experience in these highly regulated industries, you have to have proof like of 100% of the code that can execute. And the process behind it. And that's what they want to see. So if you can definitively prove that, you might be okay. But again, like every regulated industry is a little bit different. So you're going to have to see kind of what works in your environment.
100%.
Oh, we got a cool question here about feature dependencies. So we were talking about the Russian nesting doll of feature flags, and it's if you have feature A depends on feature B to be active. Should they fall under a single flag or perhaps nested flags? Any recommendations there, Cody?
So I get kind of queasy on, and this is just a me thing. I get a little queasy on using flags to control the enablement of many other flags. I don't mind dependencies and saying like my front end can only be enabled when my API is enabled, like as that one chain.
Yeah.
There are some people who like overcome complexity by saying, hey, I'm going to have these 5 features. They're all going to be on all the time, but they're all dependent on this like main switch. And when that's on, I just think it makes for a complicated read when someone's looking at the platform. It's sometimes hard to tell which ones these are connected to each other. That's definitely a way you can do it. And like, there are good use cases for it. It's just, again, it's the operational complexity thing of making sure that that documentation's there that says,
Yeah.
hey, these 4 features are actually controlled by this main circuit, right? This main circuit feature. And when that's on, they can all be on, but when that's off, they're all off. I think there's probably, if you look at your code, a way to like decompose that down into a little bit more manageable of a way. But if there's not, dependencies absolutely can handle that. And it is a common design pattern. It's just one that makes the operator in me a little scared.
Yeah, it gives me the heebie-jeebies. I don't feel good about that. I mean, sometimes it's necessary, but man, I always lean towards the side of when you're developing, or doing DevOps or anything, you got to cater to the lowest common denominator and just like pretend that if something happens at 3 a.m. that you're not the person on the call, it's the junior developer that just jumped on. Like, are they going to know about these nested feature flags? Are they going to know about their impact? I don't know.
Totally. Have good run books, right? Like, but it's like the more you have to rely on that, again, you're getting into people process issues. How well was it documented? Was it consistently documented? Was that reviewed? Is it approved? All these things get scary.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for joining. Please join us next month. And like Cody said, he's got an awesome event coming up, so go check him out. And thank you again, Cody. We appreciate it.
Thank you, CodeFresh. This is a good one. Yeah.